Persians, conquerors of Asia with the legendary shepherd king. Ancient peoples called the Persians people with a warrior's spirit, but the inhabitants of Persia themselves had to find themselves in the midst of the change of times and power. Having gone through upheavals and wars, a change of religion and culture, the Persians preserved themselves without forgetting who their ancestors had been. Orientalist Arthur Pope argued that Persian culture had a considerable influence on the Western world as well, setting the tone for many philosophical movements, the sciences, and even, in part, religion. Where did the Persians come from? How did they manage to build such a strong power, and where did it disappear to? Persians. To understand how powerful the Persian people were, it is enough to look at the map of ancient Persia at the height of its power. Its vast territories occupied part of modern mainland Greece, stretched to the borders of India and covered the northern part of Libya. The ancient Persians are called insatiable conquerors for a reason. In their thirst for the conquest of new lands they were not inferior to any other people. The origin of the ancient Persians even today remains a mystery. Many scientists believe that their ancestors could be the legendary tribes of the Aryans. Moreover, the correctness of this assumption is denoted by the modern name of the state into which ancient Persia became, Iran. According to researchers, the name Iran could be derived from the word Aryan, country of the Aryans. When the ancestors of the Persians came to the Iranian highlands, famous for their fertile lands, they decided to settle in their chosen places. In spite of this, many of the traditions of the nomadic people were preserved. From a tribe to a mighty Persian power. Initially there were several separated tribes on the territory of Persia, but later the rulers began to think about uniting them into one state. These ideas were perfectly realized by King Cyrus II, who created a major state from the separate lands of the Persians. Under him begins a policy of conquest. Cyrus the Great was able to conquer the territory of Media, which was then one of the largest states of the East. But these were only the first steps towards the subjugation of a large part of the world. What was the success of the Persians? As the ancient Greek historian Herodotus says, there was no secret. The Persian warriors were modest in their demands, preserving the customs of their nomadic ancestors. The hardy and disciplined Persians easily won victory after victory over their neighbors, who underestimated them and could not boast of the same level of military training. Astonishingly, even after becoming rulers of vast territories and gaining untold riches in their campaigns, the Persians still valued simplicity and modesty, in manners and in life. The Persians had an interesting tradition at the coronation. The king who ascended the throne had to go through a kind of rite of passage. For this he would eat a handful of dried figs and drink a glass of sour milk. This was how all the commoners of ancient Persia ate, and so the ruler emphasized his connection to the common people by emphasizing his modest needs. Unification of tribes. The first information about the ancient Persians we find in Assyrian texts. They tell us that in the 8th century BC an alliance of tribes, which occupied the territories near Lake Urmia, was formed. The leaders of this newly formed people were Achaemenids. Initially, the Persians could not conceive of the power that they would acquire in the future. Their lands were conquered by Assyria and then passed to Media. At that time the Persian people began to be ruled by King Cambyses I. The Median ruler gives away one of his daughters to him, and this, I believe, speaks eloquently to the fact that the Persians had already become a strong tribe to be reckoned with by other nations. But perhaps the most famous representative of the Achaemenid dynasty, which was considered the progenitor of the Persian people, was Cyrus II. The ancient historian Herodotus tells us about him in detail, which is not limited to a retelling of the facts, but also mentions the legend of Cyrus. The prophetic dream of a Midian. According to ancient legend, the Midian king Astiag, who was kindred with the Persian Cambyses, had a dream that a huge vine was sprouting from his daughter's belly, which wrapped first around Media and then many other Asian lands. The Midian king panicked when his daughter gave birth to a son. In secret, he told his assistant to kill the boy. The mercenary, however, did not want to get his hands dirty and handed the child over to a shepherd. He asked him to do all the dirty work for him. The shepherd turned out to be a decent man and raised the boy as his own son, naming him Kir. The grown-up Cyrus learned about his grandfather's vindictiveness, that he wanted to ruin him, and so in 553 BC he gathered the Persian army. As he stepped onto the Median lands, Cyrus suddenly received unexpected help from the Medians themselves, who had long dreamed of getting rid of the tyrant king. The blossom of Persia. It was Cyrus who had the honor of founding the first capital of the Persian kingdom, Pasargadae. Thanks to his warlike temperament, his talents as a commander and his ability to calculate the peculiarities of war, the Persian ruler was able to conquer vast territories. It turns out that the dream, about which Herodotus spoke, was indeed prophetic. The period of Achaemenid rule was the heyday of the Persian kingdom. In spite of this, it was also a time of decline. Life was changing, and the Achaemenids were succeeded by the Sassanids, who ruled in the 3rd century AD. At this time the Persian language became widespread, penetrating north and east, displacing Iranian dialects. Victories and defeats of the ancient Persians. The subsequent rulers of ancient Persia, Cambyses II and Darius, were worthy followers of Cyrus. The first of them was able to conquer Egypt, making it one of the Persian provinces. During the reign of Darius, the state was already a huge, powerful power. The king became known for his principles and laws to strengthen the borders. Darius tried in every way not only to expand the territories, but also to make his homeland a truly impregnable and strong power. But I want to point out that by no means always did the ancient Persians win unambiguous victories. For example, during the Greek campaign they had to face previously unknown resistance. Greece was a tidbit that many Persian rulers looked up to. Darius decided to move against the Greeks, but was defeated in many battles. In spite of this, a number of Greek cities were annexed to the Persian state. But it didn't last long. But why did the greatest power of antiquity disappear along with its people? Strange as it may seem, but the reason for this is the success of the Persians themselves. Daring conquerors, they were able to enrich themselves and create a prosperous country. In this luxury and peace, the new Persian rulers practically lounged around, enjoying life and forgetting the principles of their ancestors: discipline, simplicity, modesty. This was the moment the nations conquered by the ancient Persians had been waiting for. A crushing blow to Persia was the performance of Alexander the Great's armies. He united the Greek detachments and attacked the once mighty power. While it initially seemed that the Persian armies would destroy the Greek commander, the events that followed were one of the most improbable turns in history. Alexander the Great's army was able to break the Persian resistance, confidently conquering their lands. The subsequent Arab conquests also significantly changed the way of life of the Persians and their worldview. The people were forced to come to terms with and blend into their environment, undergoing gradual assimilation. New faith, new power. Persia seemed to be the most powerful state in the world, and it was for a time. Nevertheless, a nation was already forming beside it that would become no less a great conqueror than the Persians themselves. With the beginning of the Arab conquest in the 7th century, a new religion came to Persian lands. Zoroastrianism, previously prevalent among the Persian population, began to be rapidly pushed aside. The vast territories of Persia found themselves under various cultural influences, from Arabic to Turkic. The decline of the ancient Persian state did not mean the disappearance of this people. Until the last century, the western regions of Iran were called Persia, but the name was not used among the local population. Even the ancient name Farsi, which was applied to Persia, was considered by the descendants of the ancient Persians as only a historical region. Persians of our time. Today the Persian population of the world is about 55 million people. Most of them, of course, live in their native land, Iran. An indicator of Persian origin is, first and foremost, the language of the person. But, what is remarkable? Linguists note that quite a few people of other nations consider themselves half Persian, namely that they consider Persian their native language. Thus, there are many Azerbaijanis, Arabs, and Mazandarans among them. The aspiration of the Persian people for beauty. Of course, the drastic changes, the change of government and religion had a noticeable impact on Persian culture. Nevertheless, many works of ancient folklore have survived and become the property of the people. One of the most famous works of Persian poets is the collection, Kalila and Dimna, and the styles of poetry that emerged in ancient Persia are known today. These are ghazals, rubai, and baits. Many historical monuments make one admire the beauty created by the hands of ancient builders. I would include the Zoroastrian temples and later Muslim mosques. In everything man-made, the Persians strive to show harmony and luxury, and sometimes truly incredible beauty. Today the map of the world no longer features a state called Persia, but this does not mean that the Persian people have become weak and unremarkable. No, on the contrary, its modern representatives are dreaming of a new revival of their culture. Perhaps, in a few tens or hundreds of years, the world will again know of a mighty and great Persian kingdom, which will be reborn from the dust of ages.